Catherine, remembered by history as Lady Catherine Grey, Countess of Hertford, and Mary, remembered by history as Lady Mary Grey, the last and most overlooked of Francis Brandon's daughters, lived lives shaped not by their own choices, but by the blood that ran through their veins. They were born into a family too close to the throne for safety, and too far from it to be protected. Their elder sister Jane wore a crown for 9 days and paid for it with her head. Catherine and Mary paid a different price, slower, quieter, and in many ways more difficult to bear. They paid with their freedom, their families, and the long years of their youth, surrendered one after another to the will of a queen who would not let them go. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you've just subscribed, welcome to the family, and if you're returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we'll share the calm, complete story of Lady Catherine Grey and Lady Mary Grey, two Tudor women born into one of England's most ambitious families, whose only crime was being born too close to a throne they never sought to claim. Told slowly and with care, to help guide you into sleep, we'll softly explore their full lives, from the golden days of childhood at Bradgate, through the devastation of 1554 and the family's ruin, to Catherine's heartbreaking love story and Mary's quiet, dignified defiance, all while the great Tudor world turned around them, restless and unforgiving. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which Grey sister moved you most, Catherine's devotion or Mary's courage, help keep these stories coming. Before we can speak of Catherine and Mary, we must first speak of the woman who brought them into the world. We must speak of Frances Brandon, a woman whose name has too often been placed alongside judgment when it deserves far more than that. Frances was born on the 16th of July, 1517, at Hatfield in Hertfordshire. It was a summer birth, hurried and unexpected. Her mother had been making a pilgrimage to the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham in Norfolk when the labour came upon her early, and she was forced to stop at Hatfield, a house belonging at that time to the Bishop of Ely, to give birth. The child was christened Frances on the 18th of July, in a ceremony attended by women of considerable standing. The christening took place 2 days after the birth, as was the custom of the age, a brief interval that always carried its own quiet anxiety in an era when infant mortality was so common, and when even the most powerfully connected families knew that a child alive today might not be alive by week's end. But Frances survived, and the inheritance she was born into was extraordinary. Her mother was Mary Tudor, not the Queen who would one day burn Protestants at the stake, but the younger Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, the spirited and beautiful princess who had shone at the court of her brother like a flame in a dim room. This Mary Tudor had been sent to France in 1514 to marry the aging King Louis XII, a diplomatic arrangement that suited everyone except Mary herself, who was in love with someone else entirely. She agreed to the match on one condition, communicated with remarkable directness to her brother the king. If Louis died first, she would be free to marry as she chose. Louis was 52 and in uncertain health. Henry agreed. Louis died in January of 1515, after only 3 months of marriage. Mary Tudor had barely unpacked her French wardrobe before she was a widow. True to her bargain with her brother, she made her own choice within weeks. She secretly married Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, Henry's closest companion, his oldest friend, a man of enormous physical presence and easy charm, who had been in love with Mary for years. Henry was furious, and then, because he loved them both, and because fury could not long survive in the face of their obvious happiness, he forgave them. They paid a fine and returned to England. Charles Brandon was therefore Francis's father. He was Henry's best friend. He was the Duke of Suffolk. He was charming, brave, sometimes reckless, and devoted to his wife Mary in a way that seems to have been entirely genuine despite the several complications of his earlier matrimonial history. The Brandons settled into their English life with the ease of people for whom the world generally arranged itself obligingly, and Francis grew up in a household defined by proximity to royal power, Protestant inclination, and the easy confidence of those who have always been welcome everywhere they go. Frances was therefore the niece of the king himself. She was royal by blood, though not by title, and the world treated her accordingly. From the earliest years of her life she moved through the great houses of England with a quiet awareness of her own significance. She was present at court. She received gifts from monarchs. She attended the coronation of Anne Boleyn, where her father served as the king's sword-bearer. She was not merely privileged. She was expected to carry herself well, to make a suitable marriage, and to pass the family's standing safely to the next generation. That marriage came in the spring of 1533. Frances was just 16 when she wed Henry Grey, the Marquis of Dorset. He was 16 also, a young man whose father had served the old king, and whose family name carried weight, if not quite the same dazzle, as the Brandons. The union had been arranged by Charles Brandon himself, who had purchased the wardship of the young Henry Grey some years earlier, and held the right to arrange his marriage. Henry had previously been betrothed to Catherine Fitzalan, the daughter of the Earl of Arundel, but he had declined to go through with it, setting his sights, as his biographers have noted, rather higher. Frances Brandon was considerably higher than Catherine Fitzalan. The match was made. The wedding took place at Suffolk Place, a grand mansion on the west side of Borough High Street in Southwark, a property that had belonged to the Brandon family and which served as one of their principal London residences. It was a substantial celebration, befitting the union of the king's niece and a marquess's son. Frances became the Marchioness of Dorset. She was 16 years old, recently married, and embarking on the life that had been arranged for her since childhood. Her mother, Mary Tudor, died in June of 1533, just weeks after the wedding. Frances served as chief mourner at her mother's funeral, a solemn duty for a young bride so newly married. The grief of it, at 16, so soon after the wedding, must have been considerable. Mary Tudor had been 37 years old, still relatively young, though worn by the years. She had given Frances everything: the royal blood, the place at court, the name, the inheritance. And now she was gone, buried at Bury St. Edmunds, and Frances was alone in her new marriage with the weight of the Brandon legacy on her shoulders. Then, within months, her father, Charles Brandon, had taken a new wife. The woman he chose was Catherine Willoughby de Eresby, his own ward, 14 years old, who had previously been intended as a bride for his son Henry. Brandon was nearly 50. The match was, by any measure, startling. Frances absorbed this development with the composed practicality that would define much of her life. She had her own household to build now, her own children to raise. The turbulent romantic arrangements of older generations were not her business. The household Frances built was at Bradgate Park in Leicestershire, the Grey family's principal country seat, and the place where Frances would raise her daughters. Bradgate was remarkable even among the great houses of Tudor England. It was, at the time of its construction around 1500, one of the first unfortified country houses in England. a deliberate architectural statement that the age of castle building was over, and that the new English nobility lived in homes designed for comfort and display rather than defence. It was built of warm red brick with large mullioned windows that flooded the interior with light. 3 towers anchored its structure. A great hall anchored its social life. Gardens spread around it, and beyond the gardens stretched the park itself. Rolling Leicestershire countryside, forested ground where deer moved through the trees, and the air smelled of the particular green dampness of an English Midland summer. This was where the Grey daughters grew up, and it shaped them in ways both practical and profound. Frances's first 2 pregnancies ended in grief. A son, named Henry, Lord Harrington, was born and died in infancy. A daughter followed, and she too did not survive the earliest weeks of life. The loss of children was so common in the Tudor period that it had almost been normalised into a kind of expected sadness, a shadow over every nursery that parents learned to carry alongside their joy. But normalisation does not mean painlessness. Frances buried 2 children before she had established what kind of mother she would be. Then came Jane, born somewhere around 1537. Then Catherine, on the 25th of August, 1540. Then Mary, around the 20th of April, 1545. 3 daughters, alive and growing, filling the rooms of Bradgate with the small sounds of children learning the world. The education that Frances and Henry provided for their daughters was, by any standard, exceptional. The mid-16th century was a remarkable moment for the education of well-born women in England. The humanist movement, that great intellectual current that had swept across Europe from Italy and transformed the understanding of what learning was for, had reached the English court and taken root there. Catherine of Aragon had brought with her from Spain a tradition of educated women. Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last queen, was herself a formidable scholar. The Princess Elizabeth was already being taught Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, alongside her brother Edward, and Frances Brandon, herself the product of a household that had valued learning, gave her daughters the same access. The girls' principal tutor was John Aylmer, a man of considerable scholarly ability who would later become Bishop of London. He taught them Latin and Greek, French and Italian, history and scripture. The Grey daughters also received instruction in music, dancing, needlework, and the management of a great household. The traditional accomplishments of noble women layered onto the academic curriculum that was the particular gift of their generation. They rode horses in the park at Bradgate. They hunted, or watched the hunt, in the wooded grounds that surrounded the house. They learned to present themselves at court with the kind of easy grace that was, in the Tudor world, both an art and a survival skill. Jane was, of the 3, the most devoted scholar, and her devotion was of a kind that went beyond academic achievement into something almost spiritual. Latin and Greek were not merely subjects to her, but modes of thought, languages in which she conversed with the ancient world and with the reforming Protestant thinkers who were reshaping the religious landscape of Europe. When Roger Ascham, the great Tudor scholar and later the tutor of Princess Elizabeth, visited Bradgate in 1550, he found Jane alone in the house, reading Plato in Greek for her own pleasure, while the rest of the household rode in the grounds outside. She was 13. Ascham was astonished. He asked her why she preferred books to the hunt, and she gave him the famous reply that has been quoted ever since, that her parents were so sharp and severe, and her schoolmaster so gentle and kind, that the company of her books was the greatest happiness she could imagine. Whether this account flatters Jane at her parents' expense in a way that is entirely fair is a question worth pausing over. Frances Brandon has been shaped by this passage into a figure of cold ambition, a mother who drove her daughters toward political ends without warmth. The pinches, nips, and bobs with which Jane claimed her parents corrected her smallest errors of deportment have become the defining image of Frances as a parent. But Aylmer was writing in a book intended to celebrate Jane's piety and learning with a particular purpose, and Jane's words, as recorded by him, served that purpose. Frances was not a gentlewoman in the modern sense. She was a Tudor noblewoman who understood that her daughters' survival depended on their performing their roles correctly. Strictness was not cruelty, it was preparation. And Frances, whatever her methods, was also a woman who loved her daughters in the ways available to her. She visited the Princess Mary with them in 1549. She celebrated Christmas with Mary Tudor and her daughters together in 1551. She fought for the family's rehabilitation after 1553 with intelligence and persistence. These are not the actions of a woman indifferent to her children's fates. Catherine was different from Jane, and the contrast between them has sometimes been used to diminish her, as though being less scholarly than Jane were a kind of failure. It was not. Catherine studied what her tutors set before her, Latin, Greek, music, languages, with reasonable diligence. But where Jane found her deepest self in books and theology, Catherine found it in people. She was warm, she was social. She was drawn to the colour and movement of court life in a way that Jane never was. She was described by those who knew her as beautiful, red-haired, with the long Tudor nose that marked her as kin to the royal family, and as charming in the particular way of people who are genuinely interested in the feelings of those around them. She noticed other people's distress. She responded to it. She loved, when she loved, without reservation. These qualities would, in time, be precisely what undid her. To love without reservation, in the court of Elizabeth I, was an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. Mary, the youngest, occupied the particular position of the overlooked child in a family already overshadowed by its own significance. Jane was the great scholar. Catherine was the beautiful potential heir. Mary was neither of those things, at least not in the ways the Tudor court valued most. She was small, smaller than even the diminutive standards of her age would have explained as normal variation. Contemporary sources would describe her in terms that, read now, carry the sting of casual cruelty. But what those sources missed, because they were looking at her from the outside, was what was happening within. Mary Grey was sharp. She was observant. She had, beneath the surface of physical disadvantage and political irrelevance, a quality of mind and spirit that might, in a different world, have flourished quietly and contentedly. She had inherited something of Jane's intellectual seriousness, though without Jane's intensity. She had inherited something of Catherine's warmth, and she had a stubbornness, a quality of patient endurance that would prove, in the long, terrible years ahead, to be the thing that kept her alive and herself, when everything around her was designed to diminish her. In 1547, Henry VIII died. The world changed. Edward VI, 9 years old, and Protestant to his marrow, came to the throne. For the Grey family, this was an ascendancy. Henry Grey and his household were committed Protestants. Frances Brandon's connection to the royal family was undimmed. The years of Edward's reign, from 1547 to 1553, were years in which the Greys moved closer to the centre of English power, years in which the future seemed to belong to their faith, their politics, and perhaps even their bloodline. Jane, the eldest daughter, was sent in 1547 to live in the household of Catherine Parr and her new husband, Thomas Seymour. It was a prestigious arrangement, an education at the highest level in the household of a former queen, alongside the king's own sisters. Frances negotiated this placement with the skill of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and what it was worth. At Bradgate, meanwhile, Catherine and Mary continued their education under Aylmer's supervision, moving between the Leicestershire countryside and London, according to the rhythms of the court calendar, growing up in the long, light-filled rooms of a house that was, in those years, still one of the pleasantest places in England to be young. They could not have known, in those years, what was coming. Few people ever can. By the spring of 1553, Edward VI was dying. He was 15 years old, and his body, never robust, always somewhat fragile, had been failing him since the previous year. The physicians spoke in guarded terms, but the reality was plain to those who saw him. The Protestant boy king was not going to survive the year. The question was not whether he would die, but what England would look like when he did. The man who had done most to shape that question was John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. Dudley had risen to become the dominant figure in the Privy Council, the most powerful man in England in everything but title, by a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and the particular gift of knowing exactly which alliances to make and when to make them. He had seen off his great rival Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, having him arrested, tried, and executed for treason in 1552. Now he stood at the summit of English politics, presiding over a dying king and a succession question that threatened to undo everything he had built. The problem was straightforward and terrible. By law, by the terms of Henry VIII's last will, and by the act of succession that followed it, the throne should pass to Edward's older sister Mary. This was Princess Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a devout Catholic who had suffered years of humiliation and marginalization at her father's hands, and who had emerged from all of it with her faith and her determination entirely intact. If Mary became queen, England would return to Catholicism. The Protestant reforms of the past decade, the dissolution of the monasteries, the new prayer book, the English Bible, would be reversed, and Northumberland, who had been the architect and enforcer of Protestant governance, would be in very considerable danger indeed. Northumberland needed a different succession. He needed it sanctioned by the dying king, and he needed it arranged before Edward's death made it impossible. The solution he found was the devise for the succession, a document drawn up in Edward's own hand in the spring of 1553 that set aside both Mary and Elizabeth on the grounds of their illegitimacy and redirected the crown to the heirs of Mary Tudor, the French queen. Frances Brandon stood first in that line of descent. She was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII's younger sister. By the terms of the devise, the crown would pass to her male heirs first, but Frances had no male heirs. She had 3 daughters, Jane, Catherine, and Mary. After some deliberation and revision of the document, Edward directed the crown to Jane and her heirs, then to Catherine, then to Mary. The Grey sisters, in that order, were to be England's future queens. Frances herself, as we have noted, declined, or had the decision made for her by Northumberland, who may have calculated that an older woman with an existing husband was harder to manage than a young one freshly paired with his own son. Whatever the reasoning, the crown passed over Frances to Jane, and to bind the arrangement firmly in place, Northumberland set about marrying Jane to his youngest son before Edward could die and take the opportunity with him. On the 25th of May, 1553, 3 marriages were celebrated at Durham House in London, the Grand Strand residence that had once belonged to Edward Seymour and was now in the Dudley family's possession. The weddings were arranged with the kind of elaborate ceremony that said, to anyone watching, that these were not ordinary marriages. These were political transactions of the highest order, dressed in silk and jewels, and the music of an occasion that was meant to look like celebration. Jane married Guildford Dudley, Northumberland's youngest son. By all accounts, she was unhappy about it. She wept. She had not wanted to marry Guildford. She had had, apparently, an interest in another young man entirely, and the manner of her being directed toward Guildford struck her as high-handed and unwelcome. But she married him nonetheless, because her parents directed her to, and because in the Tudor world, a daughter of good family did not generally refuse a match made by her parents in consultation with the most powerful man in England. At the same ceremony, Catherine was married to Henry Herbert, the heir of William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke. Catherine was 12 years old. Henry was perhaps 15. It was a political match as completely as any in the room that day. The Herberts were major players in English politics, and Northumberland was shoring up alliances with every powerful family he could reach before Edward's death, made all alliances provisional. Catherine and Henry had been betrothed for some time. The arrangement had been in place since at least the previous year, and now it was made legal. The third pairing of the day was not a marriage, but a betrothal. Young Mary Grey, only 8 years old, was formally betrothed to Arthur Grey of Wilton, a man significantly older than her and connected to the wider network of Northumberland's alliances. It was understood that this betrothal would become a marriage in due course, when Mary was older. That due course never arrived. After the ceremony, Catherine, now Lady Herbert, was sent to live at Baynard's Castle, the Pembroke family's magnificent London residence by the Thames. She settled into her new household with the adaptable patience of a 12-year-old who had been prepared for exactly this kind of transition. The marriage had not been consummated, and both families understood that it would not be for some time. Catherine was barely past childhood. Henry was a boy. Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553, at Greenwich Palace. He had lasted longer than many had expected, clinging to life through the spring and into summer. But the end was clear, and it came in the early evening of a summer's day. He was 15 years old. He had reigned for 6 years. He had been, in his short life, deeply serious about his faith and deeply conscious of his responsibility to the Protestant Reformation he saw as his inheritance from his father. He was dead, and the plan set in motion at Durham House began to operate. Jane Grey was brought from Chelsea, where she had been staying with her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Northumberland, to Sion House, and there, on the 10th of July, she was told by the assembled lords that she was to be queen. The accounts of her reaction describe disbelief, then tears, then collapse. She fell to the floor. She wept. She said that she was not worthy and that the crown was not hers. And then, because she was 16 years old and alone in a room full of powerful men, and because she understood at some level that this was happening whether she consented to it or not, she gathered herself. She rose. She accepted. 2 days later she was brought by barge to the Tower of London, as was the custom for monarchs preparing for their coronation. The tower was ringing. The crowds along the riverbank watched with expressions that contemporary accounts describe as less than enthusiastic. For Catherine, watching from the edge of these great events, the days of Jane's queenship were a bewildering mixture of sudden elevation and very real danger. She was the sister of the Queen now. Her position was defined in the letters patent that had been drawn up on the 21st of June. She was second in the succession behind Jane and Jane's heirs. She was, formally, the heir apparent to a throne that had just been seized in a coup, dressed as a legal transfer of power. Jane's reign lasted 9 days. 9 days of increasing crisis as Mary Tudor, gathering support across the country with a speed that took Northumberland entirely by surprise, built the force to challenge the coup directly. The lords of England, watching which way the tide was turning, began to slip away from Jane's cause. Northumberland's allies became neutral. The neutral became openly hostile. On the 19th of July, 1553, Mary Tudor was proclaimed Queen, and the edifice that Northumberland had spent months constructing collapsed in a single afternoon. For Catherine, the consequences were immediate and brutal. The Earl of Pembroke, watching his son's position with the calm calculation of a survivor, moved at once. He separated Henry from Catherine. He went to Queen Mary. He declared his family's loyalty to the rightful queen, and he began the process of having his son's marriage to Catherine dissolved. The grounds were simple. The marriage had never been consummated. Catherine was 12. Henry was a boy. There had been no marriage bed, and everyone knew it. The annulment proceeded with the quiet efficiency of powerful men covering their tracks. By early 1554, Catherine was no longer Lady Herbert. She was simply Lady Catherine Grey again, the sister of the woman in the tower, the daughter of the man who was about to lose his head, a girl of 13 in the ruins of everything her family had built. Jane remained in the tower. Queen Mary, who was not by nature a cruel woman, hesitated over her fate. Jane and Guildford Dudley had been convicted of treason. The conviction was inevitable, since they had participated in a seizure of power, however unwillingly. But Mary was reluctant to execute a young girl she regarded as innocent of real ambition. Jane was imprisoned, not yet condemned. There was a period in which her life seemed genuinely possible to preserve. Then, in the early weeks of 1554, Wyatt's rebellion changed the calculation. Thomas Wyatt, a Kentish knight, led an uprising against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, a marriage that many Englishmen, Protestant and Catholic alike, feared would subordinate England to Spanish interests. Henry Grey, Catherine's father, the Duke of Suffolk, threw himself into the rebellion with a recklessness that can only be described as catastrophic. He raised his standard in Leicestershire. He gathered some men. The rebellion failed quickly and completely, and now Mary, who had been willing to keep Jane alive as long as Jane posed no active threat, found herself with a father in rebellion and a daughter who was a living Protestant standard. She could not leave Jane alive. On the 12th of February, 1554, Lady Jane Grey, 17 years old, scholar, Protestant, reluctant queen, was executed on Tower Green, inside the walls of the Tower of London. She was brought to the scaffold dressed in black. She spoke calmly. She prayed. She bound her own eyes with a cloth given to her by the scaffold attendant because she could not find the block, reaching out with her hands in the darkness, saying quietly, "What shall I do? Where is it?" And then she placed her head upon the wood, and the axe fell. Guildford Dudley had been executed on Tower Hill, outside the walls, a short time before. His body was brought in by cart as Jane walked to her own scaffold. She saw it. She noted, in the account that has survived, that his soul was now at rest in a better place. Henry Grey was executed on the 23rd of February, 11 days after his eldest daughter. Catherine was 13. Mary was 8. Their father was dead. Their sister was dead. Their brother-in-law was dead. The family name was dishonoured. The properties were at risk. Francis, who had navigated every turn of the previous years with considerable political skill, went to Queen Mary and threw herself on the Queen's mercy. Mary received her. The relationship between the two women, cousins, after all, both granddaughters of Henry VII, was more than merely formal. Mary restored much of what had been lost. Catherine and Mary were permitted to return to court, and so they returned. 13 and 8 years old, motherless in all but biology, for Frances was there still, managing the wreckage of the Grey legacy with the determination of a woman who would not be broken, but changed, fundamentally, irreversibly changed. The Bradgate world of books and gardens and open Leicestershire sky was gone. What remained was court life under a Catholic queen, in which two Protestant girls with an inconvenient claim to the succession had to be quiet, careful, useful, and above all invisible. The reign of Mary I lasted 5 years, from 1553 to 1558. For Catherine and Mary Grey, these were years of cautious rehabilitation and watchful survival. They were years in which the two sisters learned by necessity, a skill that their elder sister Jane had perhaps never fully acquired, the skill of existing in a world that regarded them as both politically significant and personally dangerous without drawing attention to that significance. Catherine was the more politically visible of the two. She was now 16, 17, 18, old enough to be considered for marriage, old enough to occupy a defined position in the English succession, and old enough for the question of what to do with her to become pressing for both the Queen and for the Protestant men, who watched the English throne with anxious Protestant eyes. Under Henry VIII's will, which had been confirmed by Act of Parliament, Catherine stood second in line to succeed after any children Mary might have. Mary was married now to Philip of Spain in July of 1554, and the country waited, not entirely hopefully, for news of an heir. If Mary died childless, Catherine was the next Protestant claimant. Various marriage proposals floated around Catherine in these years, some more serious than others. A match with a Scottish lord was discussed. Other European possibilities were raised. Nothing came to fruition. Queen Mary, who had no particular fondness for the Grey family given everything their father had attempted, was not inclined to facilitate Catherine's marriage to anyone who might use it to build a Protestant succession. And the Protestant men who favoured Catherine as a future queen were not inclined to accept any match that might compromise her independence or dilute the strength of her claim. Catherine waited. She attended court. She served the Queen as her position required. She watched her cousin Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the girl who had grown up as Protestant as any of them, navigate the same impossible terrain with a skill and self-control that was remarkable to observe. Elizabeth said nothing. She attended Mass. She was, in the most strategic sense, the perfect courtier, her inner life entirely concealed behind a surface of correct behaviour and gracious attendance. Catherine was not Elizabeth. Catherine did not have Elizabeth's particular genius for political self-concealment, but she watched, and she learned, and she survived. Mary, the youngest sister, was simply too young during most of this period to be a serious political concern. She was at court when the family was at court, absent when they were in the country, learning the routines of royal service from the inside with the patient attention of a child who understood that the world around her was complex in ways she had not yet fully mapped. She was 12, 13, 14 during the years of Queen Mary's reign. She was overlooked, which was, for a Grey girl in those years, the safest thing to be. Frances Brandon died on the 20th of November, 1559, the year after Elizabeth came to the throne. She was 42 years old. She had survived the execution of her husband and her eldest daughter. She had navigated the courts of Edward, Mary, and the opening months of Elizabeth with the characteristic Grey combination of intelligence and adaptability. She had, in 1555, married Adrian Stokes, her master of the horse, a man 21 years younger than she, whose name has always attracted commentary from those who prefer their historical widows to make more stately choices in their grief. But Frances was not grieving when she married Adrian Stokes. She was, by most accounts, happy. The marriage was considered scandalous in some quarters precisely because it was not a political transaction. It was a personal choice, made by a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by marriages that were political transactions, and who had decided, at last, to do something different. It is perhaps the most human thing Frances Brandon ever did. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in St. Edmund's Chapel, with the honours due her rank. Adrian Stokes erected a monument above her tomb. It stands there still. Frances Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk, granddaughter of Henry VII, niece of Henry VIII, mother of Jane and Catherine and Mary, laid to rest in the most English of all resting places, mourned by a young husband who had loved her and by two daughters who had needed her more than they knew. Her death left Catherine, now 19 years old, living at the court of her cousin Elizabeth, as the most significant Protestant claimant to the English throne, alone, unwatched by any parent, and for the first time in her life entirely responsible for her own navigation of the most dangerous political landscape in England. Elizabeth I had come to the throne in November of 1558, following the death of her half-sister Mary. She was 25 years old, intelligent in a way that unsettled even her most experienced advisers, and possessed of a particular kind of political genius that expressed itself less in dramatic action than in the sustained management of ambiguity. She did not always say what she meant. She rarely committed to what she could defer. She understood, with an instinct that seems almost physical, that power was most secure when it remained in motion, when it never settled long enough for opponents to measure and resist it. She was also the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose marriage to Henry VIII had been declared invalid and who had been executed as an adulteress. Elizabeth had therefore once been declared illegitimate herself. This was not a historical curiosity to her. It was a wound. It was the reason she understood, more viscerally than most monarchs, what it meant to have one's legitimacy contested, and why she was so extraordinarily sensitive to any challenge, even an implicit one, to her right to sit on the throne of England. Catherine Grey was such a challenge, simply by existing, simply by being the woman she was, Protestant, fertile, beautiful, and carrying in her blood the claim confirmed by Henry VIII's will and by Act of Parliament. If Elizabeth died without an heir, Catherine was the legal successor. This was not a matter of Catherine's ambition. It was a matter of law. And Elizabeth, who generally managed the law with considerable dexterity, found herself unable to manage this particular piece of it without either naming Catherine her heir, which she would not do, or having the law changed, which she could not easily accomplish without a fight she did not want. So she did what Elizabeth so often did when faced with a problem she could not solve cleanly. She refused to address it directly, and she made life as difficult as possible for the person who embodied the problem. Catherine came to court at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, took up her position as a lady-in-waiting in the royal household, and tried to be useful and unobtrusive. She was, by this point, 18 years old, a young woman of considerable personal attraction, deeply conscious of the political weight she carried, and struggling with the particular loneliness of someone who was watched constantly without ever being spoken to honestly. Elizabeth famously declared that she could not abide the sight of Catherine. Whether she said this explicitly or whether it was communicated through the 100 small freezings and snubs available to a queen, the message was clear. Catherine Grey was tolerated at court because she could not safely be kept away from it, but she was not welcome into this tightly wound world. In the late months of Queen Mary's reign, a friendship had quietly formed that would change everything. His name was Edward Seymour. He was the Earl of Hertford. not yet quite the figure he would become, but already a young man of considerable presence and interest. His father had been the Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector who had governed England in the name of the young Edward VI before Northumberland overthrew him and had him executed for treason. The Seymour family had therefore passed through its own version of the fire that had burned the Greys: a great fall from power, the loss of a father, the difficult years of rehabilitation and survival. There was, perhaps, a recognition in that. Both Catherine and Edward were children of families that had climbed too high and been brought low. Both knew what it was to live with a father's execution in their histories. Lady Jane Seymour, Edward's sister, who shared her first name with the dead Queen, had become one of Catherine's closest friends at court. Jane Seymour was a woman of learning and spirit, described with warmth in the accounts that survive of her. She served as the bridge between her brother and her friend, introducing them, creating opportunities for them to talk and to discover in each other whatever it was they discovered. The romance that grew between Catherine and Edward was not conducted openly. It could not be, but it was real, and it deepened over the months of 1559 and into 1560, gathering a weight and momentum that both of them must have known, at some level, could not be stopped by any exercise of ordinary caution. They were in love. In the court of Elizabeth I, under the eyes of a queen who regarded Catherine's very existence as a political inconvenience, this was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the most dangerous thing that Catherine Grey could possibly have done. In late December of 1560, while the court was preoccupied with the festivities of the Christmas season and the particular loosening of attention that the holidays always brought, Catherine Grey and Edward Seymour were married in secret. The ceremony took place at Hertford House in Cannon Row, Westminster, a street that ran along the north bank of the Thames between Westminster Bridge and the Palace, lined with the grand townhouses of the English nobility. Edward's London residence occupied a place on this street that gave it a pleasant aspect toward the river, and it was there, in the privacy of his house, with the sounds of the Thames outside and the Christmas season providing whatever cover an occasion of this kind could find, that the ceremony was conducted. The priest who performed the rite was anonymous. He has never been identified. He was apparently found at short notice. Some accounts suggest he was brought in from the street or found in the neighbourhood and engaged for the purpose. He performed the ceremony, the vows were spoken, and he disappeared. His name was never recorded, his whereabouts never established, his testimony never obtained. This would prove, in the years to come, to be one of the central tragedies of Catherine's life, that the man who had married her and her husband could not be found when finding him would have meant the difference between legitimacy and ruin. The sole witness was Lady Jane Seymour, Edward's sister, Catherine's friend. She was present. She heard the vows. She watched the ceremony. She understood what it meant, and she kept the secret as she had promised to do. Edward gave Catherine a document, a written record of the marriage, the kind of certificate that might serve as proof, should proof ever be needed. Catherine kept it, or rather, Catherine lost it. The exact circumstances of its loss have never been established, whether it was misplaced in the confusion of the months that followed, destroyed accidentally, or simply never properly stored in the way that an object of such importance demanded. The certificate that might have validated everything, that might have saved Catherine and her sons from years of imprisonment and illegitimacy, disappeared, and with it went the one material piece of evidence that could have confirmed the marriage beyond argument. Elizabeth, not long after the wedding, dispatched Edward Seymour on what was described as an educational tour of Europe. He was to travel with Thomas Cecil, the eldest son of Sir William Cecil, for the improvement of their education, a phrase whose diplomatic euphemism is not difficult to read. Whether Elizabeth suspected something, or simply wished to put distance between two young people, whose attachment she had begun to notice, is uncertain. What is certain is that he left England, and Catherine, left behind, discovered in the weeks after his departure that she was pregnant. The pregnancy was impossible to conceal indefinitely. The human body does not accommodate indefinite concealment, but Catherine tried for months, through the winter and into the spring and summer of 1561. As her condition became progressively more visible, and the pretense of nothing having changed became progressively more difficult to maintain, she tried because she understood with absolute clarity that the moment Elizabeth learned of this, there would be consequences that could not be undone. She was not mistaken. By the summer of 1561, Catherine was 8 months pregnant. There was no more pretending. The question was no longer whether to tell the Queen, but how, and by whose intercession, and with what hope of mercy. She needed someone powerful enough to stand between her and Elizabeth's fury, someone whose relationship with the Queen was good enough to absorb the shock of the news and transmit it in the softest possible form. She approached Bess of Hardwicke first. Bess of Hardwicke, Elizabeth Hardwicke, now the Countess of Shrewsbury by her most recent marriage, and one of the most formidably connected women in Elizabethan England, was a woman of immense social reach and political awareness. Catherine went to her and explained the situation. She begged Bess to intercede with the Queen on her behalf. Bess's response was immediate and cold. She refused absolutely. She berated Catherine, sharply, unkindly, with the particular ruthlessness of a survivor who had not survived by attaching herself to other people's disasters. She sent Catherine away. Desperate, very visibly pregnant, and running out of time, Catherine made the most extraordinary decision of her crisis. She went, in the middle of the night, to the bedchamber of Robert Dudley. Lord Robert Dudley was Elizabeth's great favourite, the man she loved, or at the very least, the man whose company she found most necessary, whose presence at her side was so constant and so intimate that the court and the country had spent years speculating about the exact nature of their relationship. Dudley occupied apartments that adjoined the Queen's own chambers. He was, in any calculation of who might most effectively plead with Elizabeth, the most likely candidate. Catherine went to his room in the dark. She knocked, or entered, or somehow caused him to be aware of her presence in the strange hour of the night when people are not supposed to be visiting each other. She explained her situation. She begged for his help. Dudley was terrified. A visibly pregnant woman, a royal claimant, the Queen's second cousin, in his bedchamber in the middle of the night, in rooms adjacent to the Queen's own apartments, with any sound potentially audible through the walls. Whatever his feelings about Catherine's predicament, his feelings about his own position were extremely clear. He got rid of her gently and quickly, and the following morning he told Elizabeth everything. The Queen's reaction has been preserved for us by the Spanish ambassador, who was watching carefully, as ambassadors in Tudor England generally did. Elizabeth, upon hearing the news, turned the colour of a corpse. That is the phrase. Not rage, not shouting, not the theatrical Tudor fury of popular imagination, but a complete draining of colour, a physical expression of the kind of cold, controlled fury that is in its way more frightening than any outburst. Catherine was arrested. She was sent to the Tower of London. The arrest was immediate. No waiting, no discussion, no opportunity for appeal. The Tower, the same place where her sister Jane had been held. The same stones, the same river outside the windows, the same enclosed sky above the walls. When Edward Seymour returned from Europe and was informed of what had happened, He was in prison too. He was brought to the Tower and lodged there, in apartments separate from Catherine's. The lieutenant of the Tower was Edward Warner, a man of evident human sympathy who made no particular show of rigour in enforcing the order that kept them apart. This would matter later, in ways that neither Warner nor Catherine nor Edward could have foreseen. Lady Jane Seymour, the witness, the friend, the woman whose testimony might have changed everything, had fallen ill with tuberculosis. She died in 1561, not long after the arrests. The marriage had one witness, and that witness was gone. The anonymous priest had never been found. The marriage certificate was lost, and Catherine was in the Tower, pregnant, separated from her husband, and about to give birth. On the 24th of September, 1561, in the Tower of London, Lady Catherine Grey gave birth to her first child. He was a boy. He was healthy and strong, a fact that, under other circumstances, would have been a pure cause for rejoicing, but which, in the particular circumstances of his birth, added a new dimension to the crisis he had been born into. He was christened Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp. The ceremony took place in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the ancient chapel within the Tower's walls, where the great and the condemned had been baptized and married and buried for centuries. The flagstones of that chapel covered, among others, the remains of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey. Catherine's son was christened above the bones of his own aunt, in the chapel of a prison, in the autumn of a year that had contained little other than catastrophe. Elizabeth, informed of the birth, intensified her hostility. A male heir, Protestant, carrying Seymour blood as well as Grey blood, combining two of the most significant Protestant dynasties in England in a single small body, was precisely the kind of existence that made Elizabeth feel most precarious. A married Catherine with a son was something qualitatively different from an unmarried Catherine without one. A married Catherine with a son whose parents' marriage had been confirmed and whose legitimacy was established would be, in the eyes of many English men, Elizabeth's rightful successor. This Elizabeth could not permit. She ordered that Catherine and Edward be kept strictly apart. The order was issued with force. The lieutenant of the Tower was told explicitly that there were to be no meetings, no communication, no proximity between the prisoner and her alleged husband. Edward Warner, the lieutenant, appears to have nodded and then done what sympathetic men in positions of moderate authority sometimes do. He did not enforce the order with any great rigour. He looked elsewhere. He allowed what the Queen had forbidden. Whether this was compassion, carelessness, or some combination of the two is impossible to say at this distance. What we know is that Catherine and Edward were not, in fact, kept strictly apart. They continued to meet. Their meetings were brief and furtive, conducted in the corridors and staircases of the Tower, in stolen hours when the watching was least attentive. And in those meetings, in the autumn of 1562, Catherine conceived again. The following spring, Archbishop Matthew Parker convened the ecclesiastical commission that Elizabeth had ordered to investigate the circumstances of the alleged marriage. The commission sat and heard evidence. Catherine told her account. Edward told his. Their stories were consistent, but consistency of testimony was not the same as proof, and without corroboration, without the certificate, without the witness, without the priest, the commission had very little to work with beyond two people saying the same thing. Lady Jane Seymour was dead. The priest had never been found. The certificate was lost. The commission, under the considerable pressure of a queen who had already determined the outcome she wanted, ruled in May of 1562 that no valid marriage had taken place. Catherine and Edward were declared fornicators. censured by the church for carnal copulation, and fined. Their son, the boy born in the Tower, whose christening had taken place above his aunt's grave, was declared illegitimate. He was ineligible, therefore, for the succession. Had the story ended there, it would have been tragic enough. But in October of 1562, Elizabeth contracted smallpox. She was gravely ill. For days, she lay in a fever of alarming severity, and those around her prepared for the possibility, the very real possibility, that the Queen might die. The Privy Council gathered in near panic. There was no heir. Elizabeth had refused to name one. If she died now, England had no clear Protestant successor of undoubted legitimacy. The council debated. Some voices favoured Mary Queen of Scots, Catholic, foreign, but with her own tangled claim through Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's elder sister. Other voices, more urgently Protestant, argued that the terms of Henry VIII's will must prevail, and that Catherine Grey, whatever her current situation, whatever the Commission's verdict, was the legal heir and should be acknowledged as such. Catherine, in her Tower chambers, aware of this debate, did not act. She did not seek advantage from Elizabeth's illness. She wrote no letters attempting to leverage the situation. She simply waited, which was what Catherine always did, because she was not a plotter, had never been a plotter, had never wanted the throne that kept being thrust toward her by circumstances and by law. Elizabeth recovered. The fever broke. The Queen lived. The succession crisis passed, for the moment, and then news reached Elizabeth that Catherine was pregnant for a second time. The rage that followed was complete. Elizabeth had ordered them kept apart. The Commission had declared them fornicators. Their son had been declared illegitimate. And somehow, in the Tower of London, under the very roof of Elizabeth's most secure custody, they had found each other again and created another child. It was, from Elizabeth's perspective, an act of extraordinary insolence, whether deliberately intended that way or not. She acted with decisive fury. Edward Warner, the lieutenant of the Tower, whose sympathetic negligence had permitted the second pregnancy, was imprisoned in his own fortress. The order was savage in its efficiency. The man who had looked away was now himself a prisoner in the place he had been appointed to oversee. On the 10th of February, 1563, Edward Seymour was brought before the Star Chamber, the powerful court that met in a painted room at Westminster and dealt with matters the Queen regarded as requiring exemplary punishment. He was fined £15,000. The figure was enormous, a sum equivalent, in modern terms, to several £1,000,000, designed not merely to punish, but to devastate, to ensure that the Seymour family's resources were crippled by the settlement. The following day, the 11th of February, 1563, Catherine gave birth to her second son in the Tower of London. He was named Thomas Seymour. He too was declared illegitimate by the Commission's existing ruling. 2 boys born in prison, to a woman whose marriage to their father had been officially unmade. 2 boys who would spend the rest of their lives as the sons of a love story that the law refused to recognize. After Thomas's birth, Elizabeth ordered the permanent separation of Catherine and her husband. This time she meant it. Catherine was removed from the Tower and sent to the care of her uncle, Sir John Grey, at Pyrgo, in Essex. Seymour was moved to his mother's house in Middlesex. Many miles separated them. Their correspondence was monitored. Any attempt to meet was forestalled. The Queen had decided that Catherine and Edward would not see each other again, and the machinery of Tudor governance was sufficient to enforce that decision without visible brutality, simply by placing them in the care of different custodians in different counties, at a distance that could not be easily crossed without permission that would never be granted. They wrote to each other. The letters do not all survive, but enough do, or enough of their content has been recorded, to give us a sense of what that correspondence was like. Catherine wrote of longing and helplessness. She wrote of love. She wrote of the sons she could not always see. She wrote to Elizabeth too, again and again, in letters of increasingly desperate supplication. She begged forgiveness, with upstretched hands and down-bent knees, from the bottom of my heart. She asked for her husband. She asked to be allowed to bring up her children together. She asked for the ordinary mercy of being permitted to live in the same house as the man she had married. Elizabeth did not reply to these letters in any meaningful way. She was not moved by them, or if she was moved, she did not permit that movement to express itself as policy. Catherine moved from Pyrgo to Sir William Petra's household, then to others, each transfer marking another stage in the slow diminishment of her circumstances and her health. She grew thinner. She developed the persistent cough that those around her noted with the same quiet recognition with which Tudor people noted all persistent coughs, as a sign of something serious, something that the body was losing its fight against. The confinement, the separation, the uncertainty, the grief of years spent waiting for a forgiveness that never came. All of it was taking a physical toll that no amount of determination could fully resist. By the end of 1567, Catherine's last custodian was Sir John Wentworth at Cockfield Hall in Yoxford, Suffolk. Wentworth died, another custodian gone, another household disrupted by the inconvenient presence of a royal prisoner who was neither formally condemned nor formally forgiven. His widow and executor were, as Tudor Times records, at their wits' end, with no instructions about what to do next. Catherine was moved to the hall regardless. She was dying by now, and those around her knew it. In January of 1568, the letters she was able to write grew shorter and weaker. She arranged what she could of her affairs. She thought of her husband. She thought of her sons. She left Edward her rings, the diamond ring of their betrothal, her wedding ring, a ring set with her own portrait, 3 circles of gold, a record in metal of what their marriage had meant and what it had cost. She sent a final plea to Elizabeth, asking that the Queen release Edward from confinement. She did not ask for herself. She was past asking for herself. She asked for him. On the 26th of January, 1568, Lady Catherine Grey died at Cockfield Hall, Yoxford, Suffolk. She was 27 years old. Tudor Times, with the careful precision of modern scholarship, records the probable cause of death as tuberculosis, aggravated by depression. The disease had been in her household. It had taken Jane Seymour, the friend and witness, years before, and the years of confinement had given it every advantage. The will to live is not invincible, and Catherine's had been tested in ways that few human wills could have sustained. Elizabeth made, as Tracy Borman of Historic Royal Palaces has noted, a polite show of sorrow. She ordered a grand funeral, with Catherine's arms quartered with those of England and France, as befitted her rank as a descendant of a Tudor princess. She sent £140 for the expenses of the funeral and the interment. She did not release Edward Seymour from confinement until June of 1571, more than 3 years after Catherine died. He had spent nearly a decade imprisoned, separated from his wife. Watching her die by installments from a distance he was not permitted to close. When he was finally freed, he returned to normal life, was restored to his position and his estates, and, with what can only be called a certain consistency of temperament, proceeded to make 2 further secret marriages. He was briefly returned to the Tower in 1595 for initiating legal proceedings to overturn the 1562 verdict on his marriage to Catherine. The proceedings failed. He outlived Catherine by more than 50 years, dying in 1621. He was 82 years old. Their elder son, Edward, Lord Beauchamp, was eventually given a great marble tomb in Salisbury Cathedral, a Seymour family monument of elaborate construction, featuring effigies of his parents lying together in stone as they had been denied in life. The figure of Catherine is placed distinctly higher than that of Edward Seymour, a deliberate statement by those who arranged the monument that she was in death as in life, the superior in rank, a descendant of royalty, a granddaughter of a princess. Whatever the law had ruled about their marriage, the tomb declared it whole. While Catherine's story was entering its final and most terrible phase, her younger sister Mary had been moving through her own years of courtly service, watching, as she had always watched, from a position of relative invisibility. She was at court. She held a position as maid of honour to Queen Elizabeth. She attended. She served. She observed. She was 20 years old in 1565. She had been at court for most of the past decade, present through all the turmoils of Elizabeth's opening years, the succession debates, the question of the Queen's marriage, the crisis of Catherine's imprisonment. She had watched her sister go to the Tower. She had watched the Commission declare Catherine's marriage invalid. She had watched the births of 2 boys in prison. She had watched, and she had understood, with a precision that experience had made exact, what happened to grey women who drew too much attention to themselves. She was also, by 1565, a woman in love. His name was Thomas Keyes. He was the sergeant porter to Queen Elizabeth, the man in charge of palace security, who oversaw the gates and the movement of people in and out of the royal residences. He was a widower with several children from his first marriage. He was approximately 40 years old to Mary's 20, and he was the tallest man at the court of Elizabeth I. Contemporary accounts place his height at somewhere between 6 feet 6 and 6 feet 9 inches, extraordinarily tall for the 16th century, when the average Englishman was considerably shorter than his modern counterpart, and when a man of 6 feet was already considered remarkable. Keyes apparently stood above the crowd in a literal sense that made him conspicuous wherever he was. He could not be missed. He could not be overlooked. Mary could not be overlooked for different reasons. She was, as we have noted, physically unconventional, small, described by contemporary sources as crook-backed and very ugly, in the blunt language of an era that did not soften such observations. Whether she had achondroplasia, scoliosis, kyphoscoliosis, or some other condition, is a question that 5 centuries of distance cannot answer with confidence. What we know is that she was small in a world that valued stature, physically distinctive in a court that prized presentation, and royal by blood in a world that made royal blood more burden than gift. The contrast between them, the shortest woman at court and the tallest man, the royal heiress and the palace gateman, the granddaughter of a princess and the widowed sergeant porter, was the kind of contrast that Tudor England found both astonishing and comic. Cecil's letter to Sir Thomas Smith, written after The Secret was out, captures the official response with a bone-dry precision that has survived the centuries. The sergeant porter, being the biggest gentleman of this court, has married secretly the Lady Mary Grey, the least of all the court. But before the marriage, there was the courtship, and the courtship was, by all the evidence available to us, a genuinely tender thing. Keyes was attentive. He was consistent. He gave Mary gifts, a ruby ring, slipped from his own finger and pressed into her hand, a golden chain with a pendant made of mother of pearl. Small, personal, chosen things, not the political gifts that circulated in the formal exchange economy of the Tudor court, but the gifts of someone who was thinking about the particular person he was giving them to. Mary would have encountered him frequently in the ordinary course of court life, at the palace gates, at entrances and exits, in the domestic spaces where a sergeant porter's duties placed him daily. They talked. They found in each other what they found, which was, from the evidence of the years that followed, something genuine enough to survive 7 years of enforced separation, a husband's broken health and early death, and the longest wait of a very long and difficult life. Mary understood the risk. She had watched Catherine. She knew exactly what awaited a grey woman who married without the Queen's consent. She had seen the Tower and the house arrests, and the letters written on bent knees. She knew that there was no version of this story that ended well for her, in any ordinary sense of ending well. She married him anyway. In choosing how to do it, however, she was more careful than Catherine had been. Perhaps because Catherine's fate had taught her something specific. She made certain there were witnesses, not one witness as Catherine had had. One witness who could die and leave no corroboration. Multiple witnesses. Her childhood friend Mary Willoughby, now the wife of Sir Matthew Arundel, and 2 daughters of Lady Stafford. 3 witnesses. People who could not all conveniently die before they were needed. On the 16th of July, 1565, while Elizabeth and the court were attending the wedding of Sir Henry Knollys and Margaret Cave, a ceremony at which the Queen's attention was thoroughly occupied elsewhere, Mary Grey and Thomas Keyes were married at Whitehall Palace. The timing was deliberate. The witnesses were deliberate. The choice to act while the court was looking away was deliberate. Mary had learned from Catherine's experience, and the lesson she had taken was not "don't do this," but rather "do this more carefully." Within a month, the secret was out. The Queen was informed, and the reaction, though perhaps fractionally less incandescent than it had been at Catherine's news, possibly because Mary was considered a lesser succession threat, was swift and decisive. Cecil wrote his letter. The marriage was described as monstrous. Thomas Keyes was committed to the Fleet Prison, not the Tower, which was for people of higher rank, but the Fleet, which was a prison of considerably harsher physical conditions. Mary was placed under strict house arrest at Chequers in Buckinghamshire, in the custody of William Hawtrey. They were separated, and they never met again. The separation of Mary and Thomas Keyes was enforced by distance and by the machinery of Tudor governance, with the same impersonal efficiency as every other cruel thing that machinery had accomplished in the lives of the Grey sisters. Mary was at Chequers. Thomas was in the Fleet. The miles between them were not many. Buckinghamshire to London was not a great distance, even in the 16th century. But the miles might as well have been an ocean, because there was no permission to cross them. For Thomas Keyes, the Fleet prison was genuinely brutal. He was not a man of high rank who could expect comfortable accommodation and the tolerant treatment that went with it. He was the sergeant porter, a servant of the court, elevated somewhat by his position, but fundamentally a commoner. And the Fleet treated commoners as the Fleet was designed to treat commoners. He was held in close confinement. The conditions were hard. There is a detail preserved in one account that tells us more about those conditions than any general description could. That at one point, a warden fed him his meat in a sauce made of dog medicine. It is a small, specific, particular cruelty, the kind of thing that reveals exactly what kind of place the Fleet was, and exactly what kind of vulnerability a man in Keyes's position occupied. He was at the mercy of whoever chose to be merciless. He wrote letters. In June and July of 1566, he wrote repeatedly to Cecil from the Fleet, begging for intercession with the Queen. He offered to have the marriage annulled, if that would secure his release. Edmund Grindal, the Bishop of London, who was assigned to investigate the situation, found that any dissolution of the marriage would need to be done judicially, a formal process, properly conducted. Elizabeth showed no inclination to initiate such proceedings. The situation suited her well enough as it stood. Keyes remained in the Fleet. Mary remained at Chequers. For Mary, Chequers was a different kind of confinement. She was not in a prison in the conventional sense. She was in a country house, surrounded by the Buckinghamshire countryside, with 2 windows in her room through which she could watch the sky. The physical conditions were better than the Fleet, but confinement is confinement, and the particular confinement of someone who has committed no crime, who has broken no law that should rightfully exist, who has done nothing more than marry a man she loved without permission. That confinement has its own texture, its own weight, its own slow grinding damage. The walls of the room where Mary was kept still bear marks that have been interpreted as her own work. Scratched images, including a winged creature, carved into the plaster of the walls in the way that confined people have always left their marks on the surfaces of their imprisonment. Her letters from that room, begging Elizabeth for her freedom, were later framed and hung there. They remain. Hawtrey, her custodian, described her arrival at Chequers in terms that suggest her material circumstances were poor. He wrote to warn that she had little in the way of personal effects, and that her furniture was in such poor condition that he had furnished her rooms himself at his own expense. When Mary was subsequently transferred to the household of the Duchess of Suffolk, Catherine Willoughby, the woman her grandfather Charles Brandon had married after Mary Tudor's death, and therefore Mary's step-grandmother, the Duchess saw the state of the girl and her belongings, and wrote at once to Cecil in alarm. The granddaughter of a princess, the great-niece of a king, was being maintained in conditions that would have seemed inadequate for a woman of considerably lower rank. In 1568, Catherine died. The news reached Mary, wherever she was by then in the custody chain, and she was now, for the first time in her life, the last surviving Grey sister, the last grandchild of Mary Tudor in the senior line, the last, the smallest, the most overlooked, and now the only one standing. Elizabeth's attitude toward Mary did not measurably soften. Mary moved from the Duchess of Suffolk's household to that of Sir Thomas Gresham, a wealthy and prominent London merchant, one of the founders of the Royal Exchange, a man of sufficient means to maintain Mary at a reasonable standard, without requiring the Queen to trouble herself about the expense. Gresham accepted this arrangement with the composure of a man who had not been given a great deal of choice. His wife Anne accepted it rather less composedly. The Greshams wrote repeatedly and urgently to anyone who might listen, to Cecil, to Dudley, to anyone with the ear of the Queen, begging to have Mary removed from their care. Her presence, they explained, severely curtailed their freedom. They could not leave their own house without making arrangements for the monitoring of their prisoner. They were, in their own estimation, imprisoned by the woman they were imprisoning. Through these years, through the custody of Hawtrey and the Duchess of Suffolk and the Greshams, through the slow erosion of the years in custody, Mary waited for news of her husband. And in 1569, some news came. Keyes had been released from the Fleet. His health had been broken by the conditions of his imprisonment, but he was alive, and he was out. He was permitted to return to Sandgate Castle in Kent, of which he had once been captain. He asked permission to retire with Mary to Kent, to live with his wife, in the house he had been appointed to govern, as the simplest possible life that remained available to him. Elizabeth refused. They could not meet. They were not permitted to write freely. They existed in a kind of parallel containment, he in Kent, she in London and Buckinghamshire, both at liberty in a technical sense, and both effectively prisoners of the Queen's continued displeasure. Thomas Keyes died sometime before the 5th of September, 1571. He had been perhaps 47 or 48 years old. The fleet had taken what the years would have taken eventually regardless, but it had taken it faster, with unnecessary deliberateness. Mary received the news, as an account records, grievously. She had loved him. She had married him with 3 witnesses, and at the cost of 7 years of her youth. She had sat in rooms she had not chosen, in houses she had not wanted to be in, for the sin of loving someone who could not be loved without permission. And now he was dead in Kent, having never been allowed to come back to her. That autumn, the autumn of 1571, Mary sat for a portrait. The painter was most likely Hans Ewerth, a Flemish artist who had worked for the Tudor court since the 1540s and whose work was characterized by a meticulous attention to the surfaces of his subjects, to their clothes and their jewels, and the expressions they chose to present to the world. The portrait he made of Mary is small, as she was small, and remarkable in its quiet particularity. Mary wears carnations in her hair. In the flower language of the Tudor period, that elaborate code of meaning that gave every blossom a significance both decorative and communicative, carnations signified love, fidelity, and remembrance. She chose them deliberately, on the occasion of sitting for a portrait that she knew would outlast her, and that would say, to anyone who looked at it with attention, what she most needed to say about herself and about the life she had lived. And on her hand, prominently, clearly, unmistakably, is her wedding ring, the ring that had cost her everything, the ring she had received from Thomas Keyes in a ceremony at Whitehall Palace on a July afternoon, while the Queen was attending someone else's wedding, the ring whose existence had sent her husband to the fleet and sent her to a room in Buckinghamshire with marks on the walls. She was still wearing it. She had never taken it off. She would not take it off. The portrait hangs today at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence in Buckinghamshire, the same house where Mary had been confined, where she had scratched images on the walls and written letters that nobody in power was willing to act on. It is a curious and fitting arrangement. The place that imprisoned her now displays her, and the ring she refused to remove is still visible to anyone who looks at her across the centuries. After Keyes died, the years continued their slow passage. Mary was no longer in active house arrest by this point. Her formal confinement had been lifted in May of 1572, after 7 years, when Elizabeth finally permitted her to live where she chose. But freedom, for Mary, meant something different from what it had meant before 1565. She had been through too much, and lost too much, for freedom to feel entirely like itself. She lived modestly. She was not wealthy. She had inherited several of her mother's baronies upon Francis's death, properties in Warwickshire, Lincolnshire, and Nottinghamshire that gave her an annual income of £20. As a maid of honour to the Queen, she had earned £80 per annum. These were not large sums. She was not poor in any absolute sense, but she was not rich, and the years of confinement had not improved her material circumstances. She maintained her connections. She kept what remained of her social network. She continued to exist, in the quiet margins of Elizabethan court life, as herself, the last Grey sister, the woman who had defied the Queen for love and had the wedding ring to prove it, the small and overlooked descendant of a dynasty that might have ruled England and had instead been consumed by England's existing ruler. The succession question that had haunted the Grey sisters' lives continued without them. Catherine's sons, Edward, Lord Beauchamp, and his younger brother Thomas, were officially illegitimate, though many people privately believed them to be nothing of the kind. Their grandfather, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, continued to press, intermittently and unsuccessfully, for the recognition of their legitimacy. Mary, Queen of Scots, remained Elizabeth's most discussed potential successor, though Elizabeth refused to name her as such, and the relationship between the two queens remained one of the great sustained tensions of the age. In 1587, Elizabeth finally signed the warrant for Mary, Queen of Scots' execution. In 1595, the Earl of Hertford was briefly returned to the Tower for attempting once more to have his marriage to Catherine legally recognised. None of this directly touched Mary Grey. She was no longer part of the machinery of succession politics in any active sense. She was simply a woman in her 30s, living quietly in London, wearing her wedding ring, outliving everyone who had tried to undo her. Toward the end of 1577, some sources suggest, Mary was reappointed as a maid of honour to Queen Elizabeth. If this is true, it is one of the stranger passages of the entire story. The woman Elizabeth had imprisoned for an impermissible marriage, returning to the Queen's household, still wearing the ring of the husband she had not been permitted to keep, serving at court in the same role she had occupied before all the catastrophe began. Tudor life contained these ironies, and Tudor people navigated them with a pragmatism that looks almost casual from the outside. But the rehabilitation, if it happened, came late. It came to a woman in her early 30s who had lost her husband, her years of youth, and her sisters. It came to someone who had been waiting for it for so long that the waiting itself had become a kind of identity. In April of 1578, plague moved through London. The disease was a regular visitor to the city. It came in the warm months. It killed with the indifferent efficiency of a natural event, and it spared no rank or station. Mary fell ill. She understood, in the way that people sometimes understand these things with a clarity that bypasses denial, that this illness was serious. She drew up her will. She distributed what she had, the modest possessions of a woman who had never been permitted to accumulate much, who had spent her best years in custody and her later years in careful, constrained freedom. To her step-grandmother, the Duchess of Suffolk, she left her mother's jewels, Frances Brandon's jewels, the material inheritance of the woman who had given her life. To Lady Arundel and to Adrian Stokes's wife, she gave gifts of plate, and to her godchild, Mary Merrick, the granddaughter of Thomas Keyes, she left a sum of money. In her final arrangements, she remembered Thomas. She remembered his family. She had loved him, and she had married him, and she had outlived him, and even at the end, she kept faith with what that had meant. She died on the 20th of April, 1578. It was her birthday. She was 33 years old, 33 years to the day, after she had been born into the Grey family at Bradgate Park, into the world of books and gardens and wide Leicestershire sky that had preceded everything else. It was the kind of coincidence that, in another era, might have been read as poetic or meaningful. Born and died on the same date, in a life bookended by the same point on the calendar. Whether she knew, in those final days, that her birthday and her death day were converging, whether this meant anything to her, comforted her, or distressed her, we cannot know. She left no account of it. Queen Elizabeth granted her cousin an imposing funeral at Westminster Abbey. The chief mourner was Susan Bertie, the daughter of Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, who had been Mary's step-grandmother and one of the few people who had shown her consistent kindness in the years of her confinement. The arrangements for the funeral were conducted with the respect due Mary's rank as a descendant of the royal house. Whatever Elizabeth had done to Mary while she was alive, she gave her the dignity of an appropriate burial. Mary was interred in her mother's tomb in St. Edmund's Chapel at Westminster Abbey, beside Frances Brandon. The granddaughter, placed alongside the mother who had borne her, in the most magnificent church in England, in an unmarked grave, No name carved in stone, no date, no inscription to tell the visitor who she was. The grave is still unmarked today. With Mary's death in 1578, the grey line in the senior branch came to its effective end. Jane had died childless on a scaffold at 17. Catherine's sons had been declared illegitimate and spent their lives in the shadow of that ruling. Mary had no children at all. 3 sisters, 3 lives of extraordinary difficulty and endurance, and nothing left behind, in the formal terms of dynasties and successions, but the stories themselves. After Mary died, the succession question continued its slow resolution without the Greys. The primary claimant under the terms of Henry VIII's will became Margaret Stanley, Countess of Derby, the only surviving child of Eleanor Brandon, the younger of Frances Brandon's 2 aunts, herself a daughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon. But Margaret was elderly, and her claim was entangled in its own complications. When Elizabeth finally died in March of 1603, after 45 years on the throne, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Queen of Scots, the Stuart line that Henry VIII's will had specifically excluded in favour of the Brandon line. The Stuarts came to the throne, not the Greys. The world Edward VI had tried to build, the Protestant succession that Northumberland had arranged, and that Catherine and Mary had been made to carry and to suffer for, became, in the end, irrelevant. But history does not always measure itself by who got the crown. There are other measures. Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp, Catherine's elder son, born in the Tower of London on the 24th of September, 1561, lived until 1612. He spent much of his adult life attempting to establish the legitimacy of his parents' marriage. He was not entirely unsuccessful. While the official ruling was never formally overturned, the popular understanding of his parents' situation, that they had genuinely married, genuinely loved each other, and been genuinely wronged, was widespread and persisted through his lifetime and beyond. His grandfather, the Earl of Hertford, had the great marble monument erected in Salisbury Cathedral, where Catherine and Edward lie together in stone at last, as they were denied in life, with Catherine's effigy raised above her husband's to insist upon her rank even in death. The monument remains. Thomas Seymour, the younger son, died in 1600. His life is less documented than his brother's. He was born second, lived second, and has been remembered second, as younger siblings often are. The portrait of Mary, painted in the autumn of 1571 by Hans Ewirth, hangs at Chequers. The Prime Minister of England looks at it from time to time, while working at the country residence that was once Mary's prison. Mary looks back. She wears carnations and a wedding ring. She has been looking back for 450 years. The scholar Leander de Lisle, whose biography of the 3 Grey sisters, the sisters who would be queen, has done more than any other modern work to restore their stories to serious historical attention, has argued that all 3 deserve to be remembered as something more than footnotes to Lady Jane Grey's famous 9 Days. This is true. Jane's story captures the popular imagination. The scholar queen who reigned for 9 days, the young Protestant martyr who died with such extraordinary composure, the face in countless portraits looking out from the past with an expression that reads as both sad and resolved. She is the Grey sister we remember, but Catherine and Mary lived longer, suffered longer, and endured more. Catherine bore 2 sons in a prison, was separated from her husband and her elder boy for the last years of her life, and died at 27 with her marriage still officially unmade and her pleas still officially unanswered. She was gentle, and she was faithful, and she was destroyed with a thoroughness that no act of violence could have accomplished. Slowly, by degrees, by the simple, sustained refusal of a queen to grant her the ordinary conditions of human life. Mary watched her sister's destruction and then chose the same path, not because she was reckless, but because she understood something that the Queen did not quite understand, that a person can be confined in a room, but they cannot be confined in a self. Mary chose Thomas Keyes with full knowledge of the consequences. She wore his ring through 7 years of house arrest, through his imprisonment and his broken health and his death, through the long, quiet years that followed. She wore it when she sat for her portrait. She wore it to her grave. That is not a small thing. In the world these women occupied, where queens decided what was permitted, where royal blood was both inheritance and imprisonment, where love required permission from someone who would not give it, choosing to love without that permission was an act of the deepest possible seriousness. Catherine and Mary chose it. They kept choosing it. They never stopped. We remember Jane because her story ends dramatically, with a young woman dressed in black walking calmly to a scaffold on a cold February morning, speaking her faith aloud to the small crowd assembled. It is a scene that lodges in the imagination and does not leave. But the stories of Catherine and Mary deserve to lodge there too, not because they end dramatically. They end slowly, in borrowed houses and unmarked graves, in a country house in Suffolk and a plague-ridden London April, but because they contain something that dramatic endings sometimes obscure. The long, difficult, ordinary courage of people who kept going when keeping going was all they had left to do. We have come now, at last, to the end of the lives of Catherine and Mary Grey, 2 women born into the most dangerous family in Tudor England, who survived one disaster only to find themselves moving toward another, who spent the better part of their short lives as prisoners for the simple, irreducible crime of choosing who they loved. The world they were born into, the wide-windowed rooms of Bradgate Park, the gardens and the Leicestershire countryside, the childhood of learning and music, and the particular confidence of children whose family stood near the centre of the most powerful court in England, had promised them something. Not security exactly. Tudor life rarely offered security to anyone standing close to the throne, but possibility, the sense that the future was large and that they were in some way equal to it. What the future actually gave them was smaller and harder. It gave them Elizabeth's hostility and the Tower and the country houses of reluctant custodians. It gave them love, but love hemmed in by law, love conducted in secrecy and sustained across enforced distances, love that had to prove itself not by growing, but by surviving. It gave them children born in prisons, marriages declared invalid by commissions appointed by queens who had decided in advance what the verdict should be. And yet, Catherine chose love when love was forbidden, when the price was clear and the mercy uncertain. She bore her sons in the Tower with a courage that the accounts of those around her describe with consistent admiration. She wrote to Elizabeth in terms of the deepest submission, with upstretched hands and down-bent knees, because submission was what the situation required, not because she believed she had done wrong. She had not done wrong. She had married the man she loved. She had had his children. She had kept faith with him across years of separation that would have undone lesser devotions. She died at 27, having lost almost everything except the thing she had started with, the knowledge that she had loved and been loved, and that no commission's ruling could reach inside that fact and unmake it. Mary watched her sister's life and made the same choice, with witnesses this time, and with the particular quiet courage of someone who has looked at the cost of a thing and decided that the thing is worth the cost. She bore her years of house arrest without breaking. She bore the death of her husband without being able to sit beside him. She bore the long patience of the 1570s, living quietly in the diminished circumstances of a woman who had been too visible for too long, and she wore her ring. every day, in every room of every house she inhabited. She wore it in the portrait that would outlast her by centuries. She wore it until her last morning. The wedding ring on the hand of the woman in the portrait at Chequers is not defiance, exactly. It is something older and quieter than defiance. It is fidelity. It is the declaration made without words that some things cannot be undone by official rulings, that a marriage witnessed by 3 people on a July afternoon, spoken in vows before God and before living human witnesses, is real, regardless of what any queen or commission says about it, that Thomas Keys was her husband, that she was his wife, that this was true on the day it happened and remained true on the day she died, and the 4.5 centuries since have not changed it. So let these be the images you carry with you into sleep tonight. Not the tower, not the fleet, not the country houses and the custodians. Let it be Bradgate Park, the wide gardens and the warm brick walls and the Leicestershire summer. 2 girls somewhere in the grounds, Catherine and Mary, still young, still unafraid, still themselves before the world had finished explaining to them what it intended to cost them to be who they were. Let it be the sound of the Thames outside a window in the autumn of 1561, and a woman singing to a newborn son in the Tower of London, giving him the name of the father she would not see again for months, would not be permitted to live beside for years, and would outlive by only 7 years herself. Let it be a woman in a painted portrait, small and dignified, with carnations in her hair and a ring on her hand, looking out from the wall of a country house at everyone who passes and no one in particular, keeping faith with something that no one and nothing could take from her. Sleep well. We will meet again on Sleepy Crown Reborn.